All right. Yesterday we just worked with setting up the trig functions. Today we're going to actually use them. So SOHCAHTOA, remember, is the acronym to remember the three trig ratios. The S stands for sine. So it's the sine of the angle. So that's just a theta sign. It's a Greek alphabet letter, just like using an X or a Y. So that just means the sine of the angle equals opposite over hypotenuse, SOH. Cosine, C, of the angle equals the adjacent over hypotenuse, CAH. And then the tangent of the angle equals opposite over adjacent. So remember, if the hypotenuse is used, you got to use one of these two. If it's not used, you got to use tangent. When you set these up, one of these three things is going to be missing. You're going to know two of them. You're either going to know a side and an angle, or eventually it's the last thing we do is the two sides and you're finding the angle. What we've done before and what you're still going to do is on a right triangle, if you know two sides, remember you can find the third side by using what? Pythagorean theorem. 4 squared plus 10 squared, and then you square root it. If it's the hypotenuse and leg that you know, then you subtract them. 16 squared minus 10 squared and square root it. So the difference now today is, instead of knowing two sides, you're going to know an angle and a side, and you got to find the two missing sides. So, when you're solving these, does everyone know how to spot the hypotenuse? The hypotenuse is opposite the 90. The two legs form the 90. Now, does everyone know how to spot an opposite side and an adjacent side? It's just what it says. As long as you remember adjacent means next to. So when you're solving these, this is the best thing to do, is look at the angle first, the angle given to you. Then look at the number given to you. Is that an opposite, adjacent, or hypotenuse? It's a hypotenuse, which means I'm going to have to use one of these two. Let me erase all those. So that counts out tangent. Now you got a choice. Do you want to solve for X or Y? It doesn't matter which one you want to solve for. Pick one. X. So X now, you got to figure out, is that opposite of the angle or adjacent to the angle? It's opposite. So now that I figured out what the sides are labeled, which trig function do I got to use? Sine. So all you do is you fill in these numbers up there. You take the sine of the angle, which is what? 70 degrees, equals the opposite side over the hypotenuse. Now remember, this part right here represents a number. That's what we did on the second part of the assignment yesterday. Make sure, again, your calculators are all set to degrees. The sine of 70 rounded to 4 decimal places is 0.9396, so that round to 0.9400. So, you solve these just like you solve algebra equations. What do you have to do to get the x by itself? Multiply by 10. Times 10? Take this side times 10. Now the biggest error some people do is they type this in correctly. They'll go 10 times the sine of 70, and then they forget to press equals. Make sure you press equals. 9.39, all of these we round to the nearest tenth. So then we would just round that to 9.4 equals x. So this is 9.4. Then, in order to find y, again, we're going to use the hypotenuse. I could use this number, but since I rounded it, you're better off not using it, because then it'll make it off a little bit more. So use the hypotenuse, and then how does y relate to 70? Is it adjacent or opposite? Adjacent. So you've got to use cosine. The cosine of 70 degrees equals adjacent over hypotenuse. So again, what do you do to solve it? Times 10, times 10. And what does that turn out to be? Someone doing this? 3.4. Okay? Now, you can do something a little differently here that saves some time. You can do it this way to find these two sides, but quicker is once we found this second side right here, now that you know two sides, what could you do to find the third? Pythagorean theorem. So you could just go, since it's hypotenuse and leg, 10 squared minus 9.4 squared, and then square root it. And you get 3.4. Now, just to warn you, if you do that this way, sometimes you may be off by 1/10 because this is a rounded number. Not very often. So if you are off by 1/10, it's not wrong because this is all rounding, so that's a correct way to do it. Now, in these two trig functions, it was this number missing. Right? So all we did was multiply by the bottom to solve it. Now sometimes the bottom number is missing. So in this one, we got to find the two legs. I should point out, eventually they tell us to solve right triangles. If they tell you to solve it, that means you got to find all the missing pieces, which is this, and what else is missing in this triangle? This angle. So if that's 25, and we know that's 90, we can figure this out easy. It's 65. You're not going to have to do that yet, but later on in the chapter, you got to find all of them. So here's the angle. 12 is given to us, so it's 12 the adjacent, hypotenuse, or put the iPads away. Why do I gotta say that every day? Is 12 the adjacent, opposite, or hypotenuse? Adjacent. Now you choose, do you want to find x or y? X. X is opposite. So, which one do we got to use? Tangent, right? Opposite over adjacent. Sine has the hypotenuse, isn't it? So, the tangent of 25 equals opposite over adjacent. So once again, the missing one is on top. So to get the x by itself, I just take it times 12. Times 12. .59, which would round to 5.6. Oops, I wrote the wrong one. Then, to find the hypotenuse, you could write another trig function, or you could just take the Pythagorean theorem. Since it's the two legs, you go 12 squared plus 5.6 squared and square root it. round the nearest tenth is 13.2. Now, let's just say you would have chose to find y first. This is adjacent, this is hypotenuse. So then which trig function would you use? Cosine, adjacent hypotenuse. Cosine of 25 equals the adjacent over the hypotenuse. So, these are a little different. The y is on the bottom. So if you think back to when we've had equations before, I'm just making this up, nothing to do with that now. If you had 6 equals 20 divided by x, what would you do on this equation to get x all by itself? Divide by what? No? No? The first thing, anytime the variable's on the bottom, you gotta get it to the top. So you take this times x and take this times x. So this would be 6x equals 20, and then what do? Then you divide by 6. X equals 20 over 6. Now, anytime you've got a letter on the bottom, that's the steps you gotta go through. Since you're going to be doing a ton of these, it's easier just to remember what's going to happen. What happened to the 6 and the x in the last step? They just switched spots. That's going to happen every single time on these. So if you ever have the bottom that's missing, all that's going to end up doing when you go through the algebra is these two are going to swap spots. So y is going to equal 12 divided by the cosine of 25. The last problems we did, we took the number times it. These problems, you're going to take the number divided by it. Okay? So 12 divided by the cosine of 25, we get the same answer, 13.2. Okay? Okay, for this one, here's the angle. The number given to me is opposite of the angle. So then you decide which one you want to find first. X or Y? Y. Y is adjacent to 20. Now remember, I pointed this out yesterday, some people say, well, X is also adjacent to it. They are hooked to it. But why is X not considered adjacent? Because it's the hypotenuse, right? So when you set this up, opposite and adjacent is the tangent. So we just fill them in. Tangent of the angle equals opposite over adjacent. So this is one of those where the y is on the bottom. So when you go through and solve it, these two are just going to end up swapping spots. So it'd be y equals 10 divided by the tangent of 20. And that's 27.47, so that would be 27.5. Then, now that you know two sides, you could just use the Pythagorean theorem. Since it's the two legs, it's 27.5 squared plus 10 squared, square rooted. .26, which would round to 29.3.